This episode is part of the pool's Local Officials Stronger Together podcast series. It's one way we serve local officials through integrity, public service, fiscal responsibility, and operational excellence. As always, please direct specific questions about coverage to your risk management advisor.
Welcome to the TML Risk Pool's Local Officials Stronger Together podcast series. I'm your host, Scott Houston. Today, we'll be explaining House Bill 471, which is a new state law that became effective last September. The bill applies to a city, or really any political subdivision, I'll use the term city for today's podcast, that employs first responders, that is, police officers, firefighters, or emergency medical services employees. And I'm really betting that a lot of you haven't heard of this yet. What does the law require in a nutshell? The way we're reading it, it typically applies to a first responder who is injured or becomes ill in the line of duty and is entitled to workers' comp benefits. The interesting thing, though, is that this is not a workers' compensation bill. Rather, it requires a city to essentially make up the difference between a first responder's workers' comp benefits while they're out on leave and their full pay for up to 1 year. The pool is actually offering a new coverage to our members who currently have workers' comp and liability coverages in which we will help offset the cost to do so. But this new coverage, again, is not workers' comp coverage. It's a separate endorsement through your liability plan to help offset those costs. We've only got 15 minutes as usual, so let's jump right into our discussion with Bill Longley, TML General Counsel, about the basics of what the bill does. Then, as always, we'll do your action items to help you get everything you can from our partnership. Okay, so we're talking about House Bill 471 today, and House Bill 471 gives a first responder the right to a leave of absence for an injury or illness related to the first responder's line of duty. They get that leave of absence at full pay, and it is required to last for at least up to 1 year. So there's a lot about the bill that is very simply written, but it also leaves some gaps for city officials to try to understand exactly how they're supposed to implement it. So I'm talking to Bill Longley today, TML General Counsel. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
You bet. I'm glad it's the first time to have you on the podcast. And I want to ask you some questions about how this bill works. So I talked about what the bill requires just now. Let's get into some of the specifics. Who exactly is it that's entitled to the leave or pay required by this bill?
So the bill applies to certain paid first responders who are employees of a political subdivision. And for our purposes, we focus mostly on cities, so that would include a city. The three categories of first responders are a permanent paid employee of the fire department of a political subdivision, and that includes a fire chief, but does not include a volunteer firefighter. It applies to emergency medical services personnel who's a paid employee of a political subdivision, and applies to a paid employee who is a full-time licensed police officer who regularly serves in a professional law enforcement capacity in the political subdivision's police department, and that also includes a police chief.
So basically police officers, firefighters, and EMS personnel, and probably as it concerns the risk pool, the only other members, except for some odd outliers that would be dealing with this, would probably be emergency services districts that have paid firefighters.
Right.
Okay, so that's who the bill applies to. One of the things that the bill does not define is what is an injury or illness that's, quote, related to a person's line of duty. What does that mean? What do we think that means?
Well, the bill itself doesn't define the term. So we have a couple of other places to look towards to try to understand that terminology. Under workers' compensation law, which is not binding in this case, that's a separate type of a system. But Under workers' compensation law, a compensable injury or illness has to be suffered during the course and scope of employment. For leave under HB 471, the term related to the person's line of duty could be more expansive than that language in the workers' comp law. But with the bill passing just last legislative session, we still don't have any case law interpreting what that terminology means. So under House Bill 471, a city could presumably define the term in its implementing procedures in any reasonable way. So that terms could mirror a workers' comp definition of compensable injury. In that case, a firefighter who's injured while performing authorized exercises during their shift at the fire station would typically be entitled to workers' comp benefits. But on the other hand, the same firefighter who's exercising at their home while they're off duty probably is not.
So the bill's not very clear about what the person's line of duty means. I'll talk later about how, for purposes of the pool's coverage, it's best and easiest and most efficient for us to use that workers' comp definition. The other thing I want to talk about finally is full pay. Again, the bill's not real clear on that. Tell us what we think at full pay means.
Yeah, so we've got another undefined term in the bill and now in statute. Full pay just doesn't have a statutory definition. We can again look towards workers' compensation law. Again, not binding for this type of a leave, but under workers' comp law, that provides that a person's temporary income benefit amount, which is also called the average weekly wage calculation, is the average of the amount of money the employer paid the employee in the 13 weeks before the injury or illness. And that includes things like overtime pay or hazard pay that could get rolled into that total amount. The calculation also would include other benefits, things like health insurance or something like a car allowance. Under this bill, under HB 471, a city could presumably define the term in its implementing procedures in a reasonable way, like the previous terminology we talked about. For example, the city could follow the average weekly wage calculation used for workers' comp purposes, but the city's not required to do that. In the alternative, a city could define the term locally to include the first responder's regular salary without overtime and could exclude other benefits. We really just, because the term's not defined in the statute, we don't have a clear sense of that right now. So what we're doing is we're encouraging city officials to consult with their local legal counsel to make that determination, also keeping in mind that there could potentially be a legislative reaction to that decision. So I think that cities probably should expect some of the terminology to be clarified or further defined in future legislative sessions, beginning as early as the regular session in 2025.
Wow. Well, thanks for being here, Bill. And city officials need to really understand how important the work that the TML legislative and legal teams do during session and after session and helping us understand legislation like this. So it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for being here. And I hope we'll have you on a future podcast, Bill.
Hey, it's an honor for me to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast. Thanks for having me.
All right. Welcome back to your action items. This new legislation seems like it should be simple, but as you can see from my discussion with Bill, interpreting it can be challenging. So today, let's just do 2 action items. First, if your city employs first responders, check out the FAQ below this podcast that we've prepared on the bill and the new coverage that we're providing to help offset that gap between a first responder's workers' comp benefits and their full pay. Second, if you have concerns about how you'll pay for the bill's requirements, reach out to your risk management advisor to learn more about our new coverage. I'll put a contact link below the podcast as well. Okay, that's it. Thanks for being our partner, and be sure to tune in to another episode soon.
To review written materials associated with the presentation or to ask Scott a question, please visit www.tmlirp.org and click on the Stronger Together podcast link. Please remember that the information in this episode is provided for informational purposes only and doesn't constitute legal advice. We recommend that you review the podcast and the accompanying written materials with your attorney prior to taking action.